Say your prayers, bring lots of ammunition, and brush up on your aim. It's time to go risk your life for the ultimate cause. Dear Jerky, you may think I'm joking, but that stuff is insanely good when done right. I would gladly go out in the woods and be stalked by crawlers and Bigfoots for a taste of the good stuff. But that brings me to what we're discussing today. 5 extremely creepy and allegedly true hunting stories. So this happened about a year ago. My friend John had been discussing the upcoming hunting season for mule deer here in southeast Idaho. He told me to go up a ridgeline near a place called Black Canyon. We discussed his recent trip up there and how there was a herd hanging around the area. You see, in Idaho, the deer are hard to find. The woods are so large there that an animal could go its whole life without seeing a single person. John and I had been discussing how I, a recently diagnosed type 1 diabetic, could find a deer that season without having to hike through miles upon miles of timber. As I was figuring out the details of my hunt in my head, John smirked and laughed to himself. I asked what was so funny. My dad never goes up Black Canyon, John replied. I asked why? He made a face and tried to imitate his dad's voice. There's something up there. Drove off the bears onto the mine. John is a fairly no-nonsense person, and his dad drinks a lot, so obviously he never takes his dad seriously. While I didn't think much of this info, so I forgot all about it, I figured a big sow with her cub was up there and keeping everything away. So I started to prepare for my hunt after the conversation. I couldn't hike super far yet, so I bought a cheap tree stand. I'm pretty much the only person in town to use a tree stand here for deer hunting, so I got made fun of when people found out. I ignored them, though. To heck, if I was going to let diabetes take away my ability to hunt, I could still enjoy things. So I set up the stand on the edge of a small clearing up Black Canyon with my dad. The clearing had plenty of deer signs, so we were in luck. There was also a well-established game trail nearby, so it was really turning out to be a great spot. A few weeks later, opening day, I got myself up to the tree stand and began to wait for deer. Morning soon turned to noon, and I still hadn't seen a thing. I took the moment to climb down to stretch my legs. I decided I'd take a nap at the base of the tree, so I laid against my pack and snoozed a bit. I woke up about an hour or two later. I immediately began hearing this weird sound coming from up the canyon. It was a whooping sound, and it was quite high-pitched. I was struggling to guess what it was coming from. After about 5 whoops, I heard another whooping sound from the east wall of the canyon, and then silence. The whole forest went silent at this. I climbed back into my stand. It was going to start getting dark soon, and the deer would be moving again. After a little while, I heard some brush moving, and I got my rifle ready. That's when a doe popped out of the brush with a fawn, but my tag was for a buck, so I just watched them bound past me. All of a sudden, I heard a loud crack, like a stick being broken in half after being stepped on. But this didn't sound like a stick. It was more like an entire tree had been snapped in half. I figured a moose was walking around, so I focused on the direction of the noise. I could see a black spot in between the trees, so I zeroed in on it with my scope. It took me a moment to register what I was looking at, but I realized that it was a face, a black face with a wide mouth, a flat nose, dark eyes, and it was staring back at me. It looked human, but not. It felt weird. It looked like a human's body. It was huge, definitely as big as a moose, but it was quite wide, too wide to be a moose or a regular person. I don't remember much after that because I heard the thing scream, and it was like 10 semi-trucks roaring their engines all at once. It was terrifying. I fired in its direction. I probably missed, but it was enough to scare the thing away. I climbed down. I was getting out of there, but before I could get more than a few feet from my stand, I suddenly blacked out. I woke up with my dad kneeling over me. He had called me, but didn't get an answer, so he became concerned and came looking for me. I don't remember how he got me all the way to my car through those woods. All I know is that I haven't been in those woods since. I gave John the go-ahead to get my deer stand, and I told him he could even keep it. But when he found it, he told me a tree had fallen on the ladder and bent it up. I didn't know what to think of this. I don't think it was a tree that fell on it. I think that thing took a whack at it, so I wonder what would have happened to me if I hadn't left. I told my dad about the thing I saw. He said he believed me. He said, "Lots of weird things happen in the woods." I plan on going back eventually, but not to Black Canyon, and never alone, because I don't want to get caught alone with something like that again. It wasn't a cougar from Gavin D. My grandpa died when I was 10 years old. Believe it or not, he was attacked and killed by a mountain lion. The area we live in is known for them, and I've heard them at night. They're howls that sound like a woman being attacked. I don't know what they're doing, but I'm sure they're trying to scare me. We lived in a small rural neighborhood in Arkansas, where the nearest town is about 25 minutes drive away. So there's not much to do but swim, fish, and hunt. My grandpa used to hunt the area near the lake, as deer and other animals thrived around the lake during the winter and all year round. I used to go with him until I was around 7, when both my father and my grandpa told me I could no longer go hunting until they had taken care of more of the cougars that lived near the lake. Even though I was small, I'd always heard that cougars didn't usually attack people in groups, but I obeyed them without question. Sometimes, though, my family would go to the lake to camp or have a picnic. My father always told my sister and I to stay away from the darker area of the woods near the lake, always justifying his orders, saying they couldn't keep an eye on us if we went in there, or that it was very sneaky. We obeyed him, of course. I'm 17 now. I often take walks to the lake with my dog Heinrich, who's a 2-year-old German Shepherd. The lake is about 5 miles away from my house, so the walk takes a little more than an hour. I left the house one morning in the late spring to walk and clear my mind a bit, as my parents recently divorced, and my search for a job wasn't really going well. I absolutely loved nature. It has always comforted me. I told my dad where I was going and what time I planned to be back. I left with my .45 and a machete, and Heinrich happily followed me because he knew where I was going. It was a beautiful day out, not a cloud in the sky, and the wind was calm. After walking about 45 minutes, Heinrich started barking and ran after a large rabbit. I wanted to go after him, but he always came back eventually. I kept going, and as I was about 10 to 15 minutes from the lake, I heard a really strange noise. It was like a painful groan, but from an animal. It sounded roughly like a dog or an injured deer. I feared Heinrich had come across a mountain lion, somehow without me hearing it. I ran toward the groaning noise, and then I heard footsteps running fast behind me. I spun around to see Heinrich behind me. He looked horrified, but otherwise unharmed. I was perplexed. Then I realized that the groaning had stopped, and along with it, everything else had gone silent too. I realized then that I was in the part of the woods that was darker than the rest, the area my father had always told me never to go in. Heinrich startled me when he began to growl. He was staring at something in the distance, and then I saw movement, light brown like a deer, but it looked wrong when it came into view. It was not a deer at all. It wasn't a cougar for that matter either. This was something I'd never seen or heard of before. Something I never even imagined could exist. The creature was frail, but large, with yellow eyes and that freaking face. A face that looked like a rat was placed in a grinder head first. It had massive fangs and matted wet fur. Whatever it was, it quickly noticed us. Heinrich had alerted it with his growling. The creature stood up on back legs and walked toward me, one slow but sure step at a time. I panicked, and then I remembered I had a .45. I hoped that it would scare it away or hurt it enough that I could get away in time. I aimed down the sights and then fired 3 times quickly. I know at least one of those hit, because it screamed the most god-awful sound I'd ever heard. Imagine an entire building going up in flames with hundreds of people screaming inside. That's what it sounded like. I ran, choking on my own breath, barely managing to call for Heinrich to follow me. He did, and we booked it. I heard heavy footsteps and breathing behind me. I took my .45 again and glanced behind me to fire. This thing was too close, at least 15 feet away from me. I shot twice and ran harder, and another scream erupted behind me. And suddenly, I didn't hear any more footsteps, but I did hear something else. Something that made me stop cold in my tracks. "Gavin, don't go too far, son. That sounded an awful lot like my grandfather's voice. I know I shouldn't have stopped then, but I couldn't control myself. I stopped dead in my tracks. That voice came again. "Come back over this way. I don't want you to get hurt." I screamed and unloaded the rest of my rounds into the forest. I could not see where it was now, but I fired hectically, with blatant disregard of everything around me. When the chamber remained empty, I ran. Heinrich stayed close to me. As soon as I opened the door back home, I slammed it, and I collapsed on the floor. Heinrich lay beside me, just as tired and traumatized. "The hell are you doing, son?" My dad demanded when he saw me. I couldn't speak, though. I could just look back at him. He saw my face that I was scared. He asked me a million questions and asked if a cougar had tried to attack me. I looked at him, and the only thing I could stutter was, "Not a cougar." He looked a bit confused. I took a deep breath and said, "I don't think it was a cougar that got Grandpa." I told him my story, but I don't know if he believed me. I know what the heck I saw, and something makes me think my father does too, deep down. That was 8 months ago. I sometimes hear my name being called from the woods. I dread seeing that thing again, but I feel as if it's waiting for me. That alone keeps me awake at night. This all started towards the end of spring in 2016. I was hunting in the woods one day. It was fairly quiet, and I didn't think much of it. After having bad luck with deer, I noticed some crawfish in the creek next to me. I bent down to try to pick one up. Suddenly, in the middle of the creek, there was this loud splash of a rock hitting the water. I jerked my head up and just stared at the water, afraid to move. I looked at the trees above, and I noticed that they were still, meaning the rock hadn't fallen. I immediately thought, Bigfoot. I've seen plenty of documentaries on Animal Planet to know about this creature and the rock throwing it supposedly does. For my own safety, I quickly moved away from the woods. This next experience came a few months later in the fall. At the time, I was a Boy Scout, and we were camping at Beaumont Scout Range. That night, we were doing a flag retirement ceremony. For those of you who don't know, a retirement ceremony means we burn the flags in a certain fashion, and for us, it meant remaining silent for up to an hour. During this time, we began to hear the typical Missouri coyotes. There was apparently a pack south to our location. Then, in the middle of those calls, there was another call, much louder, much deeper than the coyotes. I was shaken by it, but I didn't say anything, even though I know we all heard it. On another occasion a month later, we were camping at the same location. This time, it was about 3 in the morning. I had awakened for an unknown reason and was trying to get back to sleep, when from the hills to the east of our tent, I heard a loud scream. Who would have been screaming that early in the morning, and what human can scream like that? I tried to ignore it, but it kept going, and my mind was reeling. Then from the west, something began responding to it with the same type of call. If I had had my phone at the time, I would have gotten it out and began recording this sound. I eventually got back to sleep, doing my best to forget about it. Later on, I asked another camper about it, but he had apparently not heard anything. A couple of years passed, and it was soon the spring of 2018. I had forgotten the previous experiences and had resumed hiking in the woods behind my house. It was always so peaceful there, and on this particular day, I had been birdwatching. I was walking home quietly, maybe talking to myself about something stupid, when a small reddish-brown animal ran across the creek, back up onto the bank, and then out of sight. I didn't see it for very long, but in the short period of time that I did, it reminded me of one thing, an adolescent ape. A month later, I was a few hundred feet from where I saw this thing, when from the other side of a ridge, I heard a splashing in the creek. Something was running around in the water, and I could hear it getting closer. I was expecting a massive ape to run over the ridge. The thought of this freaked me out, but nothing ever showed up. It just stopped instead. I waited where I was standing for what felt like hours, before hastily rushing to my home. I later read that some researchers believe that mother Bigfoots will drop their babies off at a location for periods at a time, sometimes days, while they go hunt. I believe that the areas behind my house are one of the most dangerous places in the world, these nurseries, and that what I may have seen was a baby, and that maybe I was mock-charged by the parent. Of course, I'll never know. I'm going camping again this weekend, so maybe I'll experience some new activity. I have no idea what I found deep in those hillside woods. There was no precedence in my mind for the shape that presented itself in front of us that day. Well, 20 years ago, my life was fairly aimless. I was a year or so removed from high school, and I was working at my family's business with the aim of eventually taking it over. Most of my friends had left our small town for college or greener pastures, so I, along with one of my few remaining friends, Jeff, would frequently spend our time enjoying some of the outdoor activities that our surroundings presented. Some days we fished, others we would swim or boat ride. When in season, we would hunt game, like white-tailed deer or the recently reintroduced elk species. We were riding in Jeff's Jeep, enjoying some off-roading on the logging trails that snaked their way through the surrounding mountains. It was about 9:30 in the evening, and the sun had just made its way beneath the horizon by the time we made it out onto the trails. Most of the paths we took were wide and flat, paved with gravel and bits of sandstone and coal that fell out of the big dump trucks as they went about their business hauling. The trail we had wandered onto was one that neither of us had ever encountered. It meandered its way around to the backside of the mountain and had become little more than a dirt path that was only slightly wider than our vehicle. Tree branches stretched out like the twisted, leprous arms of some forgotten beasts in the wild. That aside, we were enjoying ourselves and didn't pay these ominous signs any attention. About an hour had passed before we realized that we were well off the main trail, and we needed to turn around to keep ourselves from not being able to get out. Jeff spotted a trail up ahead of us that went out and to the left, that emptied into a large field of high weeds ringed by maples and oaks. This would be where we turned around, and also where our perception of what was real in this world got turned on its head. As he slowed the Jeep down and made the turn, the headlight swept out over the tops of the weed shafts and settled onto a large, dark silhouette. Jeff slammed his foot onto the brake pedal and sat motionless in his seat. So did I. We both stared out the windshield at a spot in front of the Jeep where the light settled, but our brains weren't making sense of what our vision was feeding it. Standing at a height of about 8 to 10 feet tall and about 4 to 5 feet wide was something that I hadn't seen up to that point in my life, something that I have not witnessed yet again. Where the light should have bounced off at different angles and shapes of the body in front of us, instead it seemed to soak into this shape. The black that made up the only discernible difference from the landscape around it was such an absence of any light that it honestly looked like it was drinking in the light. So instead of being able to see the shape illuminated by the lights, we could only see that it was there by looking at the trees and shrubs around it. Its shape was like that of a large man with a broad-rimmed hat and some kind of overcoat. The big hat shape that sat at the top of the shape in front of us sat on what could only be called a head with a slender neck that draped into lithe shoulders and down into arms that kind of disappeared into a borderless absence. There were no legs to speak of, nor were there any facial features. "Do you see what I see?" I managed to ask Jeff in a horribly shaky voice. He didn't reply, but instead threw the shifter into reverse and slammed the gas pedal against the floorboard. The back tires slung rock and dust alike into the air as we raced backward and away from this dark anomaly. The cloud enveloped the vehicle from behind and to the sides, blocking the creature from our view. Normal thought processes ceased to exist for the next few seconds as we tried in vain to grapple with what we had just seen. We only stopped racing backward when his truck slammed into a small dogwood tree on the other side of the trail we had been on. This seemed to shake some of the fog from our brains, as Jeff then put the gear shift into first and sped back down the little trail with me screaming a string of curse words that I didn't even know I knew. As the tires finally met with asphalt further down the mountain, we looked at each other for the first time since seeing the Hat Man. Neither of us spoke as we knew what the other was thinking from expression alone. He dropped me off at my place, and I stepped out of his vehicle, not knowing what to say. I turned to look at him. We both simply nodded to each other. Sadly, we never got the chance to talk about it again. This must have bothered Jeff on a disastrous level, because only a few days after this, I got a call from his sister. Jeff had overdosed and died. Only over the past few years have I heard accounts of so-called hat men and watchers. Back then, I had absolutely no idea what I was looking at or what to call that thing. I did know it was there, though. I don't know if we just happened across something we weren't supposed to see or what the case may have been, but I've carried that night with me for the past 20 years. This is my first time trying to put it on paper, and if I had a moral to share with you, it would be just be careful out there. This took place in the woods of Kentucky in the fall of 2018. My grandmother had given me a hunting rifle for my 17th birthday, so I was excited for hunting season. Disappointment came when I did not get paid enough to purchase a hunting license or tags. My grandmother and mother surprised me with all the things I would need to hunt that year, though. My grandmother owned 32 acres of land in southwest Kentucky, so I was planning on hunting for deer on her property. That was a decision that I regret terribly. I went to her house that day excited to get outside. I showered, ate breakfast, and went out to the stand. When I made it to the stand, I climbed up into it and loaded my rifle. I sat very still as I waited for a deer to show up. I remember feeling very drowsy. I must have fallen asleep because when I woke up, 2 hours had passed. I checked my phone and saw the time, 12 p.m. It was lunchtime. I started down the ladder of the stand when I noticed something moving behind it. It was a tall creature standing in the darkness of the woods. I couldn't make out many details, except that it stood nearly at the top of my 8-foot ladder stand. I heard a low growl emit from it when it noticed that I had seen it. One word came to my mind: run. I jumped down the rest of the way to the ground, and I sprinted. Whatever that thing was jumped into the sunlight after me, and I finally got a good look at it. It looked like the biggest wolf I'd ever seen, but wolves don't stand on their hind legs. I fired at it with my .30-06 hunting rifle. I heard an immense yelp, but instead of it slowing down or stopping, it charged me even faster. I did not think I could make it to my grandmother's house. At one point, I swear I could feel it breathing on my neck. But I made it back to the house. I shut the door and locked it and reloaded the rifle. My grandmother smiled and asked if I got anything. After taking a deep breath, I simply told her I'd spotted one, fired and missed. Beware the woods of Kentucky. There are things that lurk in those woods that will kill you if they get a chance. I'm simply lucky that I made it out of there. I guess that massive wolf wasn't hungry enough, or it simply wanted me to leave its forest. Hunting is in our blood, something we've had to do to survive for centuries, millennia even. But now it remains a popular pastime. But that doesn't mean it's gotten any more safe. Hunters often go missing, some remain to be found, others come back permanently changed. When you go hunting, you risk becoming hunted by something bigger, something scarier than you. Good night. If these stories made your skin crawl, remember to hit that like button and share the chills with your friends. Subscribe for more terrifying tales and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment of horror. Stay safe and keep watching for more spine-tingling stories. See you in the next nightmare.